On Christmas night, Mark and Sandra locked me out in the snow. I stood on the front porch with nothing but my purse on my shoulder. Through the narrow gap in the door, Sandra sneered the exact words she had been saying my whole life. "You cannot do anything on your own, Rachel. You are desperate." Behind her, Dylan pulled the curtains shut. The next morning, I went to the bank to use an old card my great-grandmother had left me years ago. The manager swiped it, looked at her screen, and went completely white. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please sit down. You need to see this." 48 hours later, Sandra was no longer the one giving orders. Welcome back to my channel. If you have ever been called desperate by the very people who were leaning on you the hardest, stay right here. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from today. To understand why that bank manager trembled at her screen, you have to know what happened 24 hours earlier. The truth started upstairs. The historic bed and breakfast in Asheville was supposed to be a place of warmth. That Christmas Eve, it was just loud. Mark and Sandra were hosting their annual holiday party for the town's elite. The grand living room echoed with the clinking of expensive champagne glasses and the booming, performative laughter of my family. I was in the corner, but I was not watching the guests. I was watching Peter. Peter is 7 years old. He is Dylan's son from a previous relationship, a quiet boy with mild autism who processes the world a little differently. To Mark and Sandra, he was an inconvenience. To Dylan, he was an accessory to be ignored when he was not being photographed. The bass from the holiday music vibrated through the hardwood floors. I saw Peter pressed against the heavy oak bookshelf, his small hands clamped tightly over his ears. His eyes were wide with panic. People walked right past him. Lena, Dylan's fiancée, was too busy showing off her diamond ring to notice the terrified child standing 3 feet away. I did not wait for his father to step up. I never did. I walked over, crouched down to his eye level, and offered him my hand. I did not speak because I knew the noise was already too much for him. Peter looked at me, unclasped one hand from his ear, and grabbed my fingers. I led him away from the glittering lights and the fake smiles. We went through the swinging doors into the quiet sanctuary of the industrial kitchen. The thick walls blocked out the heavy bass. I lifted him onto the cool stainless steel counter and handed him a plate of plain crackers, just the way he liked them. His breathing finally slowed down. I brushed a piece of hair out of his eyes and stood there guarding his peace. I was the one who quietly paid for his therapy sessions. I was the one who made sure his medical fund was never empty. My family had no idea, and I preferred it that way. The kitchen was our safe haven. It was the only place in that massive estate where the air felt breathable. I watched Peter carefully stack his crackers into a neat little tower, feeling a rare moment of calm wash over me. The piece lasted 15 minutes. Then Dylan brought the papers. The kitchen doors swung open violently. Dylan walked in, trailed by Mark, Sandra, and Lena. The heavy scent of Mark's cologne and Lena's sweet perfume instantly ruined the clean air. Dylan slammed a thick folder onto the island, right next to Peter's crackers. "Sign it," Dylan demanded. I looked at the document. It was a waiver of nominal inheritance rights. Dylan was planning to mortgage the bed and breakfast to secure a loan of $250,000. He wanted to gut the heritage architecture and build a modern, soulless boutique resort. He needed my signature to clear the title process, even though they all believed Mark and Sandra were the sole owners. "I will not sign that," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Sandra stepped forward, her face tight with irritation. "Stop being difficult. Rachel, your brother is starting a real business. It is time you contributed instead of just taking up space." I looked at her, I looked at the parents who had turned a blind eye to every sacrifice I had ever made. Then I looked down at the kitchen island. Spread out near the folder were my architectural blueprints. They were my life's work. Detailed restoration plans for historic properties across the state. Dylan followed my gaze. A cruel smirk spread across his face. He picked up his glass of cheap red wine. Without breaking eye contact, he tilted his wrist. The dark liquid poured directly onto my blueprints. The wine soaked into the delicate vellum paper, ruining hundreds of hours of precise calculations and careful drafting. "Know your place in this family, you little parasite," Dylan said. Lena let out a soft, mocking laugh. Mark just crossed his arms, silently approving the destruction of my work. They waited for me to break. They waited for the tears, the screaming, the predictable breakdown of the weak daughter they thought I was. I did not give them a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the ruined paper, then looked directly into Dylan's eyes. My breathing remained completely steady. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over my mind. They thought the stain would break me. I had already won. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. My lack of reaction unsettled them. Mark, furious that I was not cowering, pointed a finger toward the back stairwell. "You are going to sleep in the attic tonight," Mark ordered, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "You will stay up there until you are ready to sign the papers and apologize to your brother." The attic was unfinished. It had no heating, no insulation, and the roof had a slow leak that they had refused to fix for years. It was freezing up there in the middle of December. It was a punishment designed for a disobedient child, not a 32-year-old woman. I did not argue. I nodded once, slowly. I turned away from them, walked up the narrow stairs, and pushed open the heavy wooden door to the attic. The air inside was painfully cold. I could see my own breath forming white clouds in the dim light. Dust coated the floorboards, and the wind rattled the thin glass of the single window. I stood in the center of the room. I did not unpack a blanket. I did not sit down on the broken chair in the corner. I just stood there and let the freezing temperature seep into my coat. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to remember exactly how cold this house could be. While my fingers went numb, my mind was running numbers. I was calculating the 72 months of ledgers. I was visualizing the heavy blue folder sitting in my lawyer's office downtown. They thought putting me in an unheated room would teach me a lesson about gratitude. They thought I would freeze into submission. I picked up my purse. I walked back down the stairs, past the kitchen, past the loud living room where the party was still raging. No one noticed me leaving. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the blinding snow. I left in silence. What they did not know was that the lock on that door, and the ground they were standing on, had not belonged to them since 2018. I owned it all. To understand how a family can lock their own daughter out in the snow, you have to understand the specific gravity of our household in Asheville. Everything revolved around Dylan. Growing up, Dylan was the golden boy. If you wanted to play baseball, Mark bought the most expensive equipment and Sandra cleared her entire weekend schedule. If Dylan was upset, the whole house had to be quiet. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just expected to orbit around his brilliance. I was the shadow. My role was entirely functional. When something broke, I was expected to fix it. When the family needed a quiet, invisible helper to keep the bed and breakfast running smoothly, that was me. I was the one who folded the linens, scrubbed the baseboards, and set the dining table. There is a specific feeling to sitting at the very end of a long dining table. It is the seat closest to the kitchen door, where you are expected to get up the most and where the serving dishes reach you last, usually empty. Nobody ever assigned me that seat out loud. I just learned it. I learned that my hunger was secondary to their comfort. For a long time, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just useful enough, they would eventually look at me with the same pride they reserved for Dylan. I thought love was a transaction. I thought if I kept paying into the family account with my labor and my silence, one day I would earn a withdrawal. I was wrong. The concept of family in that house was nothing but a performance for the town. Mark and Sandra cared deeply about their reputation in Asheville. They loved the image of being prosperous, generous business owners. Behind closed doors, they were entirely hollow. But I was not completely alone. There was one person who sat at that long table and saw the performance for exactly what it was. My great-grandmother, Gloria. She never joined in their applause for Dylan. She watched me quietly from across the room, her sharp eyes missing absolutely nothing. She knew the walls of that house were toxic, and she knew I would eventually need a way out. Before she passed away, she left me a weapon. I kept it hidden. I was not entirely defenseless in that house. I had one person who saw through the daily performance. My great-grandmother, Gloria. Gloria was the original founder of the estate. She was a woman of quiet authority, possessing a sharp mind that never dulled with age. She watched Mark and Sandra turn her beloved home into a vanity project. She watched them elevate Dylan into a fragile prince while treating me like the hired help. She never yelled at them, but her silence was its own kind of judgment. During the last months of her life, her health failed rapidly. The family was too busy preparing for the busy tourist season to sit by her bedside. Dylan claimed he was too sensitive to be around hospitals. Sandra said she had to manage the catering staff. So, I was the one who sat with Gloria. I brushed her hair, read to her, and listened to the stories of how she built the property from the ground up. One rainy afternoon, she asked me to pull a heavy mahogany box from the very back of her closet. The wood was dark and polished, secured by a small brass latch. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed it across the blanket toward me. Inside the box was an old bank card and a thick, sealed envelope of legal documents. "They will try to make you small, Rachel," she whispered, her voice fragile but absolutely certain. "They will take your light to keep themselves warm. Do not let them." She explained that she had bypassed Mark and Sandra entirely. She had secretly established an irrevocable trust, naming me as the sole beneficiary. The trust contained a seed fund she had quietly saved over decades. She knew Mark's obsession with appearances would eventually run the estate into the ground. She wanted me to have an exit strategy. I promised her I would keep it safe. When she passed away 2 weeks later, Mark and Sandra threw a lavish funeral, mostly to network with the wealthy attendees. I stood in the back, holding the heavy wooden box inside a plain canvas tote bag. I kept that box hidden under my bed for years. I never touched the money. I viewed it as a sacred memory of the only woman who had ever truly loved me. I assumed I would eventually use it to move away, to start my own architectural firm in another city, far from their shadow. Then came that cold November night. People often ask me a very logical question. If I had Gloria's trust fund, and if I was already building my own career, why did I stay? Why did I continue to scrub floors and endure their insults? It is easy to judge from the outside, but when you are conditioned from childhood to be the family shock absorber, you develop a strange kind of psychological paralysis. Therapists call it learned helplessness. You mistake your endurance for strength. You tell yourself that you are the resilient one, the glue holding the fragile pieces together. I was chained to them by an invisible, desperate hope. I thought that if I sacrificed enough, if I solved enough of their problems quietly, they would finally look at me and recognize my value. I thought love was a debt they would eventually repay once they realized how much I had given. I was wrong. In a toxic family, your sacrifice does not earn you a seat at the table. It just confirms that you are willing to eat the scraps. But my need for validation was only half the reason I stayed. The other half was Peter. I knew what it felt like to be a ghost in that massive house. I knew the exact chill of being ignored while Dylan received all the warmth. When Peter was born, Dylan treated him like a prop for family photos. When Peter was diagnosed with mild autism, Dylan and Lena completely lost interest. He was no longer the perfect accessory. I could not leave Peter to that darkness. I became his quiet protector. I paid for his specialized therapy sessions out of my own pocket, intercepting the bills before Mark could complain about the cost. I spent my evenings teaching him how to cope with the sensory overload of the bustling bed and breakfast. I built a quiet world for him in the kitchen, away from the screaming and the champagne glasses. If I packed my bags and walked out the front door, Peter would have been entirely alone. I could not abandon him to the exact same childhood that had nearly broken me. I decided to stay, to bear the weight, and to wait for the right moment. I thought sacrifice would buy love, until I saw the red letters. The illusion of our prosperous family business shattered for me in the autumn of 2018. The bed and breakfast was quietly bleeding money. Mark refused to adapt to modern booking systems or renovate the aging guest rooms. He cared only about hosting lavish dinner parties to impress the local politicians. He was buying tailored suits and expensive wine, while the commercial mortgage payments were quietly bouncing. Mark had a very specific way of handling failure. He pretended it did not exist. Shame made him silent, and his silence made the situation catastrophic. One afternoon in November, I was organizing the main office. Mark had left his bottom desk drawer slightly ajar. Stuffed aggressively all the way in the back was a thick stack of envelopes. They were unopened. I pulled them out and saw the return address of our primary commercial lender. I broke the seal on the top envelope. The text inside was printed in stark red ink. It was a final notice of default. My heart pounded against my ribs as I opened the rest of the stack. The numbers were terrifying. Mark had secretly taken out secondary loans to cover the estate's operating losses. The total commercial debt had ballooned to $450,000. The bank was done waiting. The grace periods had expired. The property was scheduled for a foreclosure auction in less than 30 days. Mark was going to let the family lose the heritage estate, the business, and the roof over our heads, simply because his massive ego would not allow him to ask for help or admit he had failed. He was planning to smile through the holidays and let the bank lock the doors in January. I sat on the floor of his office, holding the red letters. I felt a sickening wave of panic, followed immediately by a surge of cold, clinical adrenaline. I could not let the bank take the house that Gloria had built. I could not let Peter lose his only home. Mark had chosen silence to protect his pride. I realized I had to act in the dark to protect our survival. I took the letters, slid them into my bag, and walked back to my room. I made one quiet phone call. The only person I could trust with the red letters was Thomas. Thomas is Mark's half-brother. He is a brilliant financial advisor who lives 2 towns over. The family completely alienated him decades ago because he was born out of wedlock. Sandra considered him a stain on their perfect image. Mark resented him because Thomas was genuinely successful, while Mark was merely pretending to be. I sat on my bedroom floor, watching the rain hit the window glass, and read the terrifying numbers to him over the phone. Thomas listened in complete silence. The only sound on the line was the scratch of his pen as he calculated the interest rates and the auction timeline. When I finished, Thomas let out a long, heavy sigh. "Rachel," he said, his voice rough with concern, "you have the trust fund from Gloria. You have your own savings. You can walk away right now. Let Mark face the consequences of his own arrogance." I cannot let the bank take Gloria's legacy, I replied, and I cannot leave Peter. Thomas was quiet for another long moment. Then he gave me a warning that would echo in my mind for the next 6 years. You are walking into a fire, Rachel. If you buy this debt and save them, they will never thank you. A man like Mark would rather lose his home to a faceless bank than owe his survival to the daughter he treats like dirt. If they ever find out you saved them, they will not feel gratitude. They will feel humiliated, and they will punish you for it. I closed my eyes and leaned against the cold wall. I knew he was absolutely right. The truth would shatter Mark's fragile ego, and he would never forgive me for witnessing his failure. But I also knew I had the capital to stop the foreclosure. I accept the risk, I told him. How do we do it without them knowing? Thomas sighed again, recognizing the stubbornness I had inherited from Gloria. He told me I needed a corporate firewall. I needed a lawyer who operated with surgical precision, someone who could mask my identity entirely. He gave me her phone number. The name Thomas gave me was Irene. She was a senior corporate attorney in a high-rise downtown, a woman who wore sharp suits and did not waste a single syllable. I sat across from her massive glass desk and laid everything out. The red foreclosure notices, Gloria's bank card, my own architectural savings. Irene reviewed the documents with a calm, calculating gaze. She did not judge my family's financial ruin, nor did she question my motivation. She only cared about the legal mechanics of the rescue. The strategy was elegant and entirely invisible. We created an anonymous limited liability company. We named it Vermilion Heritage Holdings. On paper, it looked like a standard corporate investment firm based out of state. Irene moved with terrifying speed. Because a foreclosure auction waits for no one, she negotiated directly with the bank's asset management division. Using the substantial seed money from Gloria's irrevocable trust, combined with my own savings, Vermilion Heritage Holdings purchased the commercial note in full. We bought the debt right out from under the bank. By the 3rd week of November, the paperwork was finalized. Irene slid the final deed of trust across her desk. I picked up the heavy black pen. My hand did not shake. I signed my name on the bottom line. You understand what this means? Irene said, folding her hands together. The bank is out of the picture. Vermilion Heritage Holdings is now the sole legal owner of the estate, which means, effective immediately, you are their landlord. I nodded. I drove back to the bed and breakfast that evening. The lights were glowing warmly through the windows. I watched Mark pouring wine for a guest in the parlor. I watched Sandra laughing near the fireplace. They were completely safe. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had shifted permanently, and that the person holding the title was the daughter they had banished to the shadows. I had saved them, but Thomas's warning still rang in my ears. To protect Mark's fragile pride, the truth had to remain buried beneath a mountain of corporate paperwork. I decided to lie to them. The lie was remarkably easy to sell because it was exactly what Mark wanted to hear. I sat at the long dining table with Mark and Sandra, sliding a printed letter across the polished mahogany surface. The document was printed on heavy, expensive paper, bearing the official letterhead of Vermilion Heritage Holdings. I kept my voice soft and hesitant, perfectly playing the role of the uninformed daughter. I told them that the bank had sold their commercial note to an independent investment firm. I explained that this out-of-state company specialized in distressed historic properties and had agreed to keep Mark and Sandra on as on-site managers to maintain the estate. Mark snatched the letter from the table. His eyes scanned the terms, and I watched his posture shift. The tension in his shoulders completely vanished. The crushing weight of a $450,000 debt was suddenly gone, replaced by a lease agreement. The monthly rent was set at $1,200. For a massive historic estate in Asheville, That amount was practically spare change. It was just enough to cover the basic property taxes and the most urgent structural insurance. I set it that low intentionally. I knew that if the financial burden was even slightly uncomfortable, Mark's fragile ego would shatter, and he would start asking dangerous questions. Instead, Mark smiled. He actually puffed out his chest, completely convinced of his own business genius. He told Sandra that the new corporate owners obviously recognized his value to the local community. He bragged that he had essentially negotiated a flawless rescue deal without having to lift a finger. Sandra nodded along, praising his incredible luck and resilience. They signed the lease agreement without consulting a single lawyer. They mailed the signed copy to the post office box Irene had set up downtown. They celebrated that night with an expensive bottle of champagne, completely oblivious to the reality of their situation. For the next 6 years, 72 months exactly, an automated transfer of $1,200 left their account on the first of every month. 72 times. They paid their rent. They never once suspected that the anonymous corporate landlord depositing their checks was the same woman sweeping their floors and setting their dinner table. They loved the quiet illusion. I was the phantom landlord. While I played the role of the quiet, dependent daughter inside the bed and breakfast, my actual life was happening outside those walls. I was not a helpless maid. I was a senior preservation architect. Every morning, I left the estate before Mark and Sandra even woke up. I traded my simple house clothes for tailored slacks and drove to a bright, modern studio downtown. My days were spent running complex structural diagnostics, managing teams of contractors, and reviving historic properties across the state. I commanded respect. When I pointed out a flaw in a load-bearing wall, seasoned engineers listened to me. The contrast between my two lives was staggering. At the studio, I was surrounded by the rich scent of fresh pine, drafting paper, and expensive coffee. I made critical decisions involving hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the moment I parked my car back at the estate, I had to shrink myself. I had to become Rachel, the invisible daughter who supposedly answered phones for a minor real estate office. It was exhausting, but it was also empowering. I was entirely financially independent. In fact, my architectural salary was the secret engine keeping the bed and breakfast alive. When the estate's ancient boiler broke down in the dead of winter, Mark threw a tantrum because they did not have the cash to fix it. He spent 3 days complaining about the cold. On the 4th day, a repair crew magically showed up. Mark assumed Vermilion Heritage Holdings had approved the maintenance request out of goodwill. He even wrote a polite email thanking the faceless corporate board. He never knew that I had quietly authorized the $7,000 repair bill from my own personal savings. I did it because Peter was shivering in his room, and I refused to let the boy freeze just to teach Mark a lesson. I lived in the shadows by choice. I allowed them to treat me like a failure because it maintained the fragile ecosystem of the house. I did not need their validation anymore. I had my blueprints, my career, and my quiet authority. I built my own empire. The delicate balance I had maintained for 6 years began to collapse the moment Dylan brought Lena into the house. Lena was a woman driven entirely by status and leverage. She did not care about the history of the Asheville estate. She did not care about the hand-carved mahogany staircases or the original stained glass windows that Gloria had commissioned nearly a century ago. To Lena, the bed and breakfast was simply an underutilized asset, a stepping stone to elevate her own social standing. She manipulated Dylan effortlessly. She convinced him that running a traditional guest house was beneath him. She whispered in his ear that he deserved to be the CEO of a modern, exclusive boutique resort. She painted a picture of infinity pools, minimalist steel architecture, and wealthy investors. Dylan, who had never built anything of value in his entire life, absorbed her ambition as if it were his own. Her disrespect toward me was immediate and calculated. Lena recognized that I was the only person in the house who actually worked, which made me a threat to her narrative of superiority. She began treating me like a hired servant in front of the guests. She would leave her dirty coffee cups on the railing for me to collect, offering a sickeningly sweet smile when I walked past. One afternoon, I caught her in my bedroom. She was holding a digital measuring tape, calculating the square footage of my space. When I asked her what she was doing, she did not even flinch. She casually mentioned that my room would make a beautiful walk-in closet for the master suite they were planning to renovate. She spoke about my eviction as if it were an inevitable business transaction. Mark and Sandra did nothing to stop her. In fact, they encouraged the delusion, eagerly discussing the future resort as if they had the legal right to demolish the walls. They were drawing up spectacular plans on paper they did not own. They were planning a future on borrowed ground. I watched Lena smirk at me, completely unaware of the legal trap she was walking into. Greed makes people entirely blind. The tension finally snapped during our pre-Christmas dinner. The dining room was decorated with expensive silver garlands, and the crystal chandeliers cast a warm, deceptive glow over the table. Dylan cleared his throat and tapped his wine glass with a silver spoon. He stood up, placing a heavy hand on Lena's shoulder, and announced their grand vision for the estate. He proudly declared that they had secured preliminary approval from a local developer to gut the historic property and build the boutique resort. To fund the initial demolition and architectural permits, Dylan needed a massive injection of cash. He looked directly at Mark and Sandra and asked them to leverage the estate. He wanted them to take out a new mortgage for $250,000. Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second, likely remembering the phantom landlord, but his desire to please Dylan immediately overrode his logic. Mark convinced himself that Vermilion Heritage Holdings would somehow approve a massive structural change if it increased the property value. It was a level of financial delusion that only a deeply arrogant man could maintain. But there was a legal hurdle. Dylan pulled a crisp white document from his tailored jacket. The developer's legal team had run a preliminary background check because I was a direct blood relative living on the premises. The bank required a formal waiver of nominal inheritance rights to clear the title insurance process. Dylan slid the paper across the table toward me, placing a gold pen right beside it. "Sign it, Rachel," Dylan said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We are moving forward, and we cannot have any loose ends tying up the financing." I looked at the document. It was a blatant attempt to strip me of any future claim to the property, completely ignoring the fact that I was already the sole legal owner. If I signed it, I would be validating their right to destroy Gloria's legacy and tear apart the only home Peter had ever known. I looked at Dylan. I looked at the gold pen. I refused to sign it. The dining room went completely dead. Mark's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Sandra let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, placing her hand over her chest as if I had physically struck her. If you have ever watched someone confidently demand something that was not theirs to take, drop a yes in the comments. "Stop ruining your brother's future," Sandra snapped, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "You have lived under our roof, eating our food, taking up space, and the one time we ask you to contribute, you act like a selfish child." Dylan did not yell. He simply picked up his glass of cheap red wine and, with a slow, deliberate tilt of his wrist, poured it directly over my architectural blueprints resting on the side table. The dark liquid soaked into the delicate paper, destroying hours of my actual, successful life. "Know your place in this family, you little parasite," Dylan sneered. I did not scream. I did not cry over the ruined paper. I simply stood up and pushed my chair in, my movements calm and methodical. My silence infuriated Mark more than any insult could have. He pointed a shaking finger toward the dark stairwell. "You are going to sleep in the freezing attic tonight," Mark roared, entirely losing his polished facade. "You will not come down until you sign that paper and beg your brother for forgiveness." I looked at the three of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in their shared delusion. I picked up my purse. I did not head toward the stairs. Instead, I walked straight to the heavy oak front door. I opened it, letting the freezing December wind whip into the warm foyer, and stepped out into the blinding snow. Behind me, I heard the heavy door slam shut. I heard the deadbolt click into place. They had locked me out, entirely convinced they had won the war by banishing the weakest soldier. I started my car, letting the heater thaw my numb fingers. I stared at the glowing windows of the estate one last time. The paper monster was awake. The morning after being locked out in the snow, the air in Asheville was bitter and sharp. I had spent the night sleeping in my car with the heater running, parked at a brightly lit gas station. I did not cry. I did not waste my energy feeling sorry for myself. The time for enduring their abuse had officially expired the moment I heard that deadbolt slide into place. At exactly 9 in the morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the largest regional bank downtown. I bypassed the standard teller line and asked to speak directly with the branch manager. I sat in a quiet, glass-walled office across from a woman wearing a conservative gray suit. I reached into my purse and pulled out the old bank card Gloria had left me in that mahogany box. I handed it across the desk. I asked her to verify the current status of the connected accounts. The manager swiped the card through her terminal. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard. Then, her hands completely stopped moving. I watched the color drain from her face. She leaned closer to the monitor, reading the lines of data twice to ensure she was not making a mistake. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden, profound respect. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please sit down. You need to see this." She turned the monitor slightly so I could view the screen. The old card was the master access key to the irrevocable trust Gloria had established. But it was not just a savings account anymore. The screen displayed the full corporate architecture I had built over the last 6 years. It showed Vermilion Heritage Holdings. It showed the unencumbered commercial deed to the historic bed and breakfast. It showed the operating capital from my architectural firm. The manager realized she was sitting across from the sole legal owner of one of the most valuable commercial properties in the county. The same woman who was currently wearing a slightly wrinkled coat from sleeping in a freezing car. I asked her to print the official, certified copies of the most recent statements. I needed the bank's seal on every single page. She moved quickly, treating me with the kind of deference that Mark and Sandra spent their entire lives trying to buy. She handed me a thick, sealed envelope. I thanked her politely and walked out of the bank. The cold wind hit my face, but I barely felt it. I had the ammunition. I drove to see Irene. I walked into Irene's law office just before noon. She was sitting behind her massive glass desk, reviewing a contract. When I placed the sealed bank envelope on the table, she looked up, recognizing the shift in my posture immediately. "They locked me out last night," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "Dylan wants to mortgage the estate for $250,000. Mark and Sandra are letting him do it. It is time." Irene did not offer me pity. She offered me strategy. She opened a locked filing cabinet and pulled out the master file for Vermilion Heritage Holdings. People often mistakenly believe that family conflicts are solved by dramatic arguments or tearful confrontations. They think whoever screams the loudest or guilt trips the hardest wins the war. Irene taught me that true power has no volume. True power lives in documentation. An irrevocable trust is exactly what the name implies. It cannot be altered, cancelled, or contested by anyone, not even the family members who feel entitled to the money. Gloria had locked her wealth behind a legal fortress that Mark could never breach. Furthermore, a commercial lease is not a suggestion. By voluntarily signing that lease agreement 6 years ago, Mark and Sandra had legally defined themselves as tenants. Every time they wrote a check for $1,200, they were renewing their admission that they did not own the property. They had traded their ownership for the illusion of comfort. If they try to claim adverse possession, Irene explained, tracing a perfectly manicured finger over the lease agreement, they will fail. The checks prove they were paying for the right to occupy the space. They have zero equity. They have zero legal standing. In the eyes of the law, Mark's pride is completely irrelevant. She was right. I did not need to argue with Mark about who worked harder. I did not need to convince Sandra that she was a terrible mother. The law did not care about their blatant favoritism or Dylan's spoiled nature. The law only cared about the signatures on the bottom of the page. I felt a deep, resonant calm settle into my bones. The anxiety of being the unloved daughter evaporated, replaced by the cold precision of an architect who was about to demolish a condemned building. Only 3 pieces of paper. The sun began to set over the city, casting long, dark shadows across Irene's office floor. We spent the next hour assembling the instruments of their destruction. Irene placed a heavy, dark blue folder on the desk. Inside, she arranged 3 specific documents in a very deliberate order. The first was the certified property deed, clearly listing Vermilion Heritage Holdings as the sole owner of the estate. The second was the original commercial lease agreement, featuring the distinct, arrogant signatures of Mark and Sandra. The third was the official financial ledger, detailing exactly 72 consecutive payments of $1,200. We are about to walk into a room full of 60 guests. If you are ready for the truth to drop, hit that like button right now. I will drive you there myself, Irene said, slipping the blue folder into her leather briefcase. I want to personally deliver the notice. As your corporate counsel, it is my job to handle unruly tenants. I nodded. I went to the restroom down the hall to change my clothes. I took off the casual sweater I had worn through the freezing night and put on a sharply tailored black blazer. It was the exact jacket I always wore when I was closing a massive architectural deal. It was armor woven from thread. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not look like the girl who ate at the end of the table. I did not look like the shadow who quietly fixed the boiler. I looked like a woman who owned every single brick of the house she was about to enter. We drove back to the estate in Irene's quiet luxury sedan. The streets of Asheville were decorated for the holidays. As we approached the property, I could see the glow of the massive crystal chandeliers through the front windows. Cars lined the long driveway. The engagement party for Dylan and Lena was in full swing, doubling as a lavish New Year's Eve celebration. Mark and Sandra had invited the wealthiest people in town to witness their success. They had built a massive stage for their own vanity. They had absolutely no idea who was about to walk onto it. This time, I closed mine. The backyard patio of the estate was transformed into a glittering winter wonderland. Outdoor heaters cast a warm, orange glow over the 60 elegantly dressed guests. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. The air smelled of roasted pine and roasted lamb. Irene and I walked through the side iron gate. We stayed in the shadows near the manicured hedges, watching the performance unfold. Mark stood at the center of the patio, wearing a velvet dinner jacket. Sandra stood beside him, draped in silk, smiling at the local politicians and business owners she desperately wanted to impress. Dylan and Lena were the focal point, holding court near a massive table stacked high with wrapped engagement gifts. Dylan looked incredibly smug. He was playing the role of the visionary entrepreneur, likely telling everyone about his brilliant plan to build a boutique resort. I scanned the crowd until I found Peter. He was sitting on a stone bench near the back, isolated from the noise, holding a small toy car. Dylan had not checked on him once. That sight extinguished any lingering trace of hesitation in my chest. Mark tapped his crystal glass with a silver fork. The sharp ringing cut through the chatter, and the 60 guests slowly turned their attention to the host. Friends, family, esteemed guests. Mark began, his voice booming with practiced authority. Tonight, we are not just celebrating a new year, we are celebrating the future of our family legacy. He gestured broadly toward Dylan and Lena. My son Dylan has always been a man of immense vision. Mark continued, beaming with unearned pride. He is ready to take this historic property into the next century. To ensure he has the foundation he needs, Sandra and I have decided to officially gift the entire estate to Dylan as his wedding present. The guests erupted into warm, polite applause. Lena pressed a hand to her chest, feigning surprise. Dylan raised his glass to the crowd, soaking in the admiration. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. Heels clicked on the stone. The sharp, rhythmic sound of Irene's heels striking the stone patio cut through the fading applause. The guests parted instinctively as she walked directly toward the center of the gathering. She wore her immaculate gray suit and carried the dark blue folder. She did not rush. She possessed the terrifying, unbothered calm of a predator walking into a cage full of blind mice. I followed 3 steps behind her, my face completely expressionless. Sandra saw me first. Her smile vanished, replaced by a flash of deep irritation. Mark frowned, confused by the presence of a stranger interrupting his grand moment. Before anyone gifts this estate, Irene said, her voice clear, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion, the people in this yard should know who actually owns it. Mark let out a dismissive scoff. Who are you? This is a private family celebration. I am corporate counsel for Vermilion Heritage Holdings, Irene replied, stopping right next to the gift table. She opened the blue folder. She pulled out the first document, the certified property deed, and laid it flat on the pristine white tablecloth, right next to a silver-wrapped box. This property has been legally owned by my client since November of 2018, Irene announced to the silent crowd. You cannot gift a commercial estate that you lost to foreclosure 6 years ago. The silence that fell over the patio was absolute. 60 guests stopped breathing. Mark's face drained of all color. He stared at the crisp white paper bearing the official state seal, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Dylan stepped forward, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. He let out a sharp, forced laugh that echoed awkwardly off the stone walls. This is a joke, Dylan said loudly, looking around at the guests to gauge their reaction. It is a pathetic stunt. Anyone can print a fake piece of paper off the internet. You are trespassing. Irene did not argue with him. She did not raise her voice to match his panic. She simply reached back into the blue folder. Irene had 2 more papers. Irene did not wait for Dylan to finish his nervous laughter. She simply reached back into her dark blue folder and pulled out the second document. It was a standard commercial lease agreement, printed on thick legal paper. This is the lease agreement signed in November of 2018, Irene said, her voice projecting effortlessly across the silent patio. It clearly outlines the terms of occupancy for the estate. She placed the document flat on the table, right next to the property deed. She tapped her manicured finger near the bottom of the page, exactly where 2 familiar signatures rested on the tenant line. Mark and Sandra both stared at their own handwriting. The reality of what they were looking at began to sink in, heavy and suffocating. But Irene was not finished. She pulled out the third and final document. It was a thick, bound financial ledger. "This is the official payment record," Irene continued, turning the pages slowly. "It details exactly 72 consecutive payments, $1,200, deposited on the first of every month for the last 6 years." Mark's face lost whatever color it had left. His hands gripped the edge of the gift table as if the ground were physically moving beneath him. He looked at Irene, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Vermilion Heritage Holdings agreed to keep us on as managers," Mark stammered, clinging desperately to the lie that had protected his ego for so long. "We have a corporate agreement. You cannot just walk in here and invalidate it." "I am not invalidating anything," Irene replied smoothly. "I am simply clarifying the corporate structure for your guests. For the last 6 years, the company you have been paying rent to has been owned entirely by a single entity." Irene closed the blue folder. She took one step back, yielding the floor. She looked directly at me. "She bought this house out of foreclosure to ensure you would not lose it," Irene said to Mark and Sandra. "She kept your rent at $1,200 so you would never feel the financial burden. She is the sole owner of Vermilion Heritage Holdings." 60 faces turned toward me in absolute unison. The wealthy politicians, the local business owners, and the friends Mark had invited to witness his triumph were all staring at the daughter he had banished to the shadows. Sandra looked at me, her mouth trembling, unable to form a single coherent word. For the first time in 32 years, I did not lower my eyes. I did not shrink away. The silence in the backyard was thick enough to cut. I walked slowly past the frozen guests, past Sandra's trembling hands, and stopped right in front of Dylan. Dylan looked at me with a mixture of pure hatred and dawning terror. The $250,000 loan he needed to build his vanity resort was dead. His grand future, built on the assumption that he owned the ground beneath his feet, had just evaporated into the cold December air. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of an architect reviewing a flawed blueprint. "You told me to know my place in this family, Dylan," I said, looking him dead in the eye. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out the heavy set of keys to the estate. They were the same keys Dylan had thrown onto the kitchen counter the night they locked me out in the snow. I held them up for a brief second so he could see them gleam in the chandelier light. "This is my place," I said quietly. "I have been holding the roof over your head the entire time." I placed the keys gently onto the gift table, right on top of the property deed. The soft clink of metal against paper was the loudest sound in the yard. It was a sound of absolute, undeniable finality. I turned my attention to Mark and Sandra. They looked incredibly small, stripped of their performative arrogance. "I am not going to make a scene at your party," I told them, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "You can continue to enjoy your evening, but starting tomorrow, any matters regarding this property will be handled strictly through my legal counsel. Do not call my personal phone." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for an apology I knew they were incapable of giving. I walked back across the stone patio, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the pavement. Irene walked right beside me. Behind us, the extravagant engagement party was entirely dead. I heard one person near the back of the crowd begin to clap, a slow, quiet sound of respect. But I did not turn around to see who it was. I walked through the iron gates and out into the freezing, quiet night. The iron gate clicked shut. You cannot dismantle a lifetime of arrogance in a single night. I knew Mark would not surrender his kingdom gracefully. When someone's entire identity is built on a foundation of superiority, they will fight viciously to maintain the illusion, even when the truth is staring them in the face. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Irene's phone rang. Mark and Sandra had frantically hired a cheap, aggressive local lawyer. They sent Irene a threatening email, officially disputing the legality of the trust fund and claiming I had committed elder fraud by deceiving them about the identity of the corporate landlord. The lawyer demanded the immediate return of the deed under the doctrine of adverse possession, claiming Mark had maintained the property as the rightful owner. If they expected me to panic, they were severely disappointed. Irene called me, reading the email aloud with a tone of mild amusement. "They are threatening a massive lawsuit," Irene said, shuffling papers on her desk. "They want to drag this out in civil court to drain your architectural funds." "Let them try," I replied calmly. "Send them the countermeasure." I had anticipated this exact desperate move for years. You do not build a corporate firewall without installing a reinforced steel door. Irene did not draft a long, emotional response to their lawyer. She did not argue about morality or family loyalty. Irene simply replied to their aggressive email with a single PDF attachment. The document was a certified copy of Mark and Sandra's federal tax returns from the last 6 years, every single year, without fail. Mark had filed a specific commercial tax schedule. On that schedule, he had legally declared the $1,200 monthly payments as a deductible rental expense. He had signed his name under penalty of perjury, explicitly claiming to the federal government that he was a commercial tenant, not a property owner, in order to secure a massive tax break. Irene's accompanying message was incredibly brief. It read, "If your clients wish to claim adverse possession, we will gladly forward these tax returns to the Internal Revenue Service for an immediate audit regarding 6 years of fraudulent tax deductions. Please advise on how you wish to proceed." The response from their lawyer arrived less than 20 minutes later. They formally withdrew all claims and dropped the dispute entirely. Mark's own greed, his desperate need to save a few dollars on his taxes, had completely destroyed his only legal defense. The false counterattack was over before it even began. There would be no lengthy court battle. There would be no dramatic trial. The legal coffin was sealed. The fallout from the engagement party spread through Asheville like a wildfire. You cannot drop a bomb like that in front of 60 wealthy gossips and expect the secret to stay buried. By Monday morning, Dylan's Grand Boutique Resort project had completely collapsed. But the irony of the situation was far deeper than simply losing the estate. A few weeks later, the local news broke a massive story. The visionary developer that Dylan had partnered with, the man who had promised to turn the estate into a multi-million-dollar resort, was exposed as a career con artist. He had been running a sophisticated real estate scam across 3 states. He had already collected massive, non-refundable cash deposits from several other arrogant, desperate families before fleeing the country. If I had signed that waiver on Christmas Eve, Mark and Sandra would have taken out a $250,000 mortgage. Dylan would have handed every single penny of that cash directly to a criminal. The bank would have immediately seized the property, and the entire family would have been left with absolutely nothing. By taking the house away from them, I had inadvertently saved them from total financial annihilation for the second time in my life. When Lena realized the resort was a scam and that Dylan possessed 0 actual wealth, her affection vanished overnight. She packed her expensive bags, left her engagement ring on the kitchen counter, and walked out without looking back. Dylan was left sitting in the massive, quiet house with no fiancé, no business, and no future. Mark and Sandra knew the truth about the developer. They knew exactly what would have happened if I had capitulated to their demands, but their pride was a terminal illness. They could not bring themselves to admit that the daughter they treated like a servant was actually their savior. They sat in the bed and breakfast, surrounded by the antique furniture and the heavy silence, and chose to play the victims. They told anyone who would listen that I was a cold, calculating woman who had stolen their legacy. I did not try to correct the narrative. I did not need an apology. I had a house to clean. Reclaiming the estate was not just about taking back a building. It was about fundamentally restructuring the power dynamics of my life. On the 1st of February, I officially assumed direct control of the bed and breakfast. I did not evict Mark and Sandra. Throwing them out into the street would have made me exactly like them. Instead, I relegated them to the small manager's annex at the back of the property. They were allowed to stay, but they were strictly bound by a new, ironclad lease agreement. If a pipe burst, they had to submit a formal maintenance request to my property management software. If they wanted to paint a wall, they needed my written approval. The era of Mark playing the wealthy lord of the manor was permanently over. Dylan, however, was immediately fired. I stripped him of his imaginary executive title and banned him from accessing the estate's operational funds. He was forced to move into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of town and finally find a real job. With the toxic elements neutralized, I brought in my own architectural firm to breathe life back into Gloria's vision. We restored the original mahogany staircases. We repaired the stained glass windows. We fixed the freezing, leaking roof in the attic where they had tried to break my spirit. I hired a professional hospitality team to run the daily operations. Within 6 months, the estate was thriving, attracting guests who appreciated genuine history rather than fake luxury. I walked through the bright, polished corridors, breathing in the scent of fresh pine and old wood. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere that had haunted my childhood was completely gone. I stood in the grand parlor one morning, watching the sunlight stream across the hardwood floors. For the first time in 32 years, I did not feel like an intruder trying to earn a space. I belonged here. I reclaimed my own history. Taking the house was the easiest part of the war. The most important victory happened quietly, away from the legal battles and the public humiliation. When Dylan's life fell apart, his complete inability to handle responsibility became painfully obvious. He could barely take care of himself, let alone a 7-year-old boy with special needs. Peter was caught in the crossfire of Dylan's depression and Mark's bitter anger. The house in the annex was chaotic and loud, the exact environment that triggered Peter's deepest anxieties. I did not let him suffer. With Irene's aggressive legal maneuvering and my undeniable financial stability, I filed for partial, primary custody of Peter. Dylan, realizing he could not afford the boy's expensive therapy and secretly relieved to be free of the burden, signed the paperwork with barely a fight. I brought Peter into the main estate. I did not put him in the dark corners. I took the largest, brightest guest room on the 2nd floor, the one with massive bay windows overlooking the gardens, and redesigned it entirely for him. We installed soft, sound-absorbing panels on the walls. We painted the room in calming, muted blues. I bought him a heavy-weighted blanket and set up a long wooden table by the window where he could line up his toy cars in perfect peace. Using the profits from the restored bed and breakfast, I established the Gloria Education Fund. It was an unbreakable trust dedicated entirely to Peter's specialized education, occupational therapy, and future college tuition. I made sure that no matter what happened to me, his future would never depend on the whims of a narcissistic father. One Saturday afternoon, I was sitting in the quiet, industrial kitchen. Peter walked in, holding a plate of plain crackers. He did not look panicked. He did not have his hands clamped over his ears. He climbed onto the stool next to me, smiled, and offered me a cracker. I took it. I looked at the little boy who was finally allowed to exist without having to apologize for taking up space. The shadows were finally gone. People often believe that a family is a fixed destination, A place where you are guaranteed a seat simply because you share the same blood. But sometimes, the people who share your DNA are the ones who make you feel the most homeless. I spent 32 years trying to earn a seat at the very end of their table. I accepted the scraps, the silence, and the cold attic because I thought that was the price of belonging. I thought I was the strong one for enduring it. I know better now. True strength is not found in how much abuse you can quietly absorb. True strength is looking at a table that was built to exclude you, turning your back on it, and picking up the tools to build your own. Legacy is not what you inherit from your parents. Legacy is what you protect, what you restore, and what you refuse to let them destroy. Gloria understood that, and now I understand it too. If you have ever had to build your own table because the family one did not have a seat for you, share your story in the comments. Your voice deserves to be heard. And if this story brought you a sense of peace today, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am sitting in the bright kitchen of my own estate now. Peter is drawing pictures by the window. Thomas is coming over for dinner later. And I am cooking a meal where every single plate will be full. There are no ghosts here anymore. Remember, you do not have to sleep in the cold just because they tell you to. You hold your own keys.